If you've ever felt diminished, if you've ever doubted your voice or story, this conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay can possibly change your life. Thank you for everyone who's joined us in the Zoom audience and also folks who are watching this via live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. So today's talk is on wayfinding and how to be guided by your heart and mind with Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay. For those who are new to Community of Seven, there is one singular purpose of these Let's Talk calls, and it's to create an environment where you can be authentically who you are and have conversations with other purpose-led leaders, thought leaders, and have conversations about what matters most to you. We always start our calls with a quick check-in. If you're in the live Zoom audience, top right-hand side, put this in gallery mode so you can see other folks as well. Turn on your videos if you can as well. Raise both hands like this if the answer is yes, okay? And you could leave it down if the answer is no. How many of you have ever felt lost in their life? Not lost directionally, but just lost. How many of you have ever felt diminished or like you didn't have a voice? And this could be in a personal relationship or at work or in a family situation. How many of you have tapped into the power of your story? How many of you have lived your life guided by your mind and your heart? One hand. How many of you, last question, would like to understand wayfinding and how it can help you better navigate your life? So today's talk is about wayfinding and how you can be guided by your mind and heart with Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay. About a year ago, I started seeing these posts by Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay, and I immediately wanted to know more about her. There was this one particular post that I saw of hers where she was on a cover of a magazine looking like a goddess. And it was like saying that she was over 50. And I looked at this and I was like, oh my gosh, she's amazing. And in her post, she wrote this: we can start our lives again at any time. For anyone who's discouraged, it's never too late to be what might have been. So this one line floored me. We can start our lives again at any time. How many of us have given up, telling the world that it's too late, I'm too old, I didn't finish school, I didn't take the right career path, and so we give up. We lose our direction. I'll have to admit, I was lost for a really long time, though on the surface, I seemed like I was going in the right direction. I didn't know I was lost. There was an emptiness and unhappiness of how I was living my life. For those who don't know my story, I went to two good schools, Stanford and Harvard. I was an executive at a prestigious magazine, and then I got laid off at the height of the pandemic. And I really had to ask myself, who am I? And what is my purpose? And the question of who am I was something that I really struggled with. I thought I knew the answer, but when I really peeled the onion, I realized that the Phan, who was an exec, had an EA, and had all of the trappings of what success was, didn't make me happy. I had to dig deep into my values and what was important to me, and that became my North Star. I started to be guided by those values. For example, one of my core values and what was most important to me was my family. But I was getting home at 10 o'clock at night and not seeing my daughter, and only on the weekends. So my values weren't aligned with the life that I was living, if that makes sense. So how many of us, those of you who are listening right now on this call, get lost because we're not following our North Star, our values? Instead, we're following other people's faulty compass, and we wonder why we feel lost and empty and alone. The conversation on wayfinding with Dr. Lindsay is such an important one to be had. But before I introduce Dr. Lindsay, in the chat, For those who are watching on the live stream, or if you're watching this on the live stream in the comments, if you're watching in the Zoom audience, write this in the chat. I want you to answer in the comments, but don't press send till I tell you. What makes it so difficult for people to trust their intuition or their internal compass? Once again, what makes it difficult for people or you to trust your intuition or your internal compass? Write it down in the comments or the chat, and I'm going to count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Press send. Fear, self-doubt, always needing approval, externals, people-pleasing, programming at a young age. Someone had asked me to reread that question, and it's basically, why is it so hard for us to follow our internal compass, our intuition, right? And so I think a lot of you guys answered, and there were some really similar answers, right? Fear, little pressure, trying to follow the crowds. Thank you so much, everyone. So I'm going to make a really quick introduction. I'm so excited to have you here, Elizabeth. Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay is a cultural anthropologist and an award-winning filmmaker who travels to the world's most remote regions to protect indigenous knowledge. She was the first fellow in the history of the National Geographic Society, which is an amazing feat. She's an advocate for social, environmental, and cultural justice. Her firsthand accounts from some of the most vulnerable regions are helping reshape global perspectives on leadership and conservation. She is a recipient of the United Nations Visionary Award and the prestigious Scene Eagle Award. She has advised UN ambassadors on the crisis of environmental refugees. She has served on the board of global organizations, including the Tibet Fund for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and she sits on the Global Council for World Pulse. She was mentored by renowned Grandmaster Navigator Pismo Pialu, who was considered one of the greatest wayfinders of the 21st century. In 1999, she earned a PhD in cultural anthropology with a specialization in ethno-navigation. Her work has been featured by TED, the New York Times, Glamour, and The Economist. Drum roll, please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay. So happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really, I feel so humbled to be part of your community today. Thank you.
We are excited to have you here today. So let's start with the first question. Tell us a little bit, you have such a fascinating background. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a cultural anthropologist.
Yeah, it's actually a great question. So to begin, and I loved your question that asked why we don't turn to our inner compass, to our inner GPS, which is the most precise always. Something that I don't share publicly, but it seems so appropriate here. When I was 4, I was molested. And that experience made me feel unsafe about using my voice. And what happened as a result is that I believe in many ways that our compassion is grown as a result of our understanding and feeling very deeply about people who don't feel safe about using their voices. And as a result, I became more of an advocate for anyone who feels marginalized, especially with our voices. So thank you very much for asking the question. I was raised in Hawaii, and my parents were both educators, and they left us. My father was a spiritual leader back home, though he never talked about it. But they intentionally left us in the care of 3 old Hawaiian women. And why this part of the story matters is because these women understood that for all of us, where we stand is holy ground, and we reclaim our agency as we choose to. All of us have that capability. And they said, you can all chant the universe, which when it comes to our story and really owning our story and claiming it as unique and divine and blessed, because this is how we serve the world. When we talk about leadership, it can only come from within us. So that for me is an important part of this journey that I've made. At 7, they brought me into their circle. Now, these are women who we would go to the ocean, and under very specific lunar cycles, they would begin to chant, and the fish would come towards shore about knee high. And these 3 old women would go into the ocean. My sisters and I would stand on the shore. They would go into the ocean and use the hems of their long dresses and gather only as much as we needed. And then they would come out of the ocean, and together we would mahalo the seas and the abundance that's there. And we would go home and prepare our food. And I grew up in that context that we are surrounded by abundance, and that we are co-creating in every moment with source if we understand it. The beautiful thing is that we're all wayfinders. We're all capable of wayfinding, except in our modern world, we abandon our authority. We don't recognize how powerful we truly are. And so this conversation is particularly important to me because I want people to understand that navigating from where they currently are to where they choose to be is really not so distant. So these women brought me into their circle, and they were truly powerful. When we talk about abundance, everything they planted, they blessed, and because they saw as whatever they did was considered a sacred act. So even when we look at the work that we do in the world, whatever we're being called to do, when we apply that same commitment that everything we are creating is sacred to bless the world, to bless life itself, we come to it and the frequency is shifted, the field is shifted as a result. And so these women taught my sisters and me what it meant to truly chant the universe. And I began to see my voice just emerge as a young girl who goes through all the things young children do in terms of our own self-doubt and our insecurity, and really started to understand that within me was a voice unlike anyone else's. And that was the voice I needed to honor. And at 7, they shared a prophecy with me. And this is what they said: there will come a time when the world will be in trouble, and it will take the far edges of the earth, the wisdom in the far edges of the earth, to return the world to balance. And they said, you always have agency, and this is your choice, but someday we see that you will go far away to keep the voices of the elders alive. And this is the part of their prediction that I really appreciate. They said, it will sometimes be a lonely road, but you will look into the eyes of seeming strangers, and you will find your ohana, which means family. And it will take all of you to return the world to balance. And that part of their prophecy has kept me going for all of these years. And I believe that the community that you have helped to cultivate and the people that gather as a result are part of that family. And it will take all of us to return the world to balance. So in terms of wayfinding, their prediction came true, how this young girl that grew up very poor in a sugar plantation community has ended up being privileged enough to go around the world 14 times to the most remote parts of the world and live with cultures that have been incredibly generous to me to share their wisdom that's rapidly vanishing. And what I wanted to share with your community was wayfinding, so that we can understand, 1, what it means, 2, what it means to our lives and how we can apply some of these lessons. We can go to the first one. I didn't realize it wasn't showing. So these are the canoes that we sail on. And wayfinding in the Pacific and also in other cultures, we don't use maps for instruments. Instead, we use a system of pattern recognition where we're synthesizing data, external data, and then we bring it in, and I'll explain this in a little while, but I wanted to give a visual cue to your community of what it means to be on the ocean on these double-hulled canoes, where we use no maps or instruments. Instead, we use the rising and setting of stars, the sequence and directional points of waves, even the slightest hint of color on the underbelly of a cloud. When we synthesize all of this, it helps us to gain our bearings. What this means in the world today is that we can look at all of the external cues, what's going on in the market, what's going on geopolitically, what's going on in companies, and start to look at all of this data and start to synthesize it. And that's just part of the equation of how we gain our bearings and find our way. Cultures, whether they're in the deserts or on the oceans, use wayfinding in very similar ways. For desert cultures, they study the waves and the patterns on the sand, but they use the rising and setting of stars and the color of light on the underbelly of clouds in the same way. And one of the things that's so extraordinary about these cultures that truly humbles me is that in many ways we perceive them as being an exotic other, and that their words may sometimes seem very rudimentary. And yet to me, this is some of the most sophisticated technology I've ever seen. And I see their sciences as so necessary for these times, because I truly believe that if we can learn even the simplest lessons from these cultures, it will actually change our lives in some of the most profound ways. This is my mentor that you were introducing, Pismo. He was considered throughout the Pacific and in many parts of the world the greatest wayfinder of our time. And in Micronesia, they call these people Palu. They are navigator priests, they're mystical. So when we're on the ocean, Mao could taste the water and tell you how far we were from land. He could chant the whales and they would come on the right side of the vessel and escort the vessels in. The things that these Palu could do, there was one Palu that I was with, 104 years old. He chanted down 14-foot waves so that we could come ashore, we could cross the reef and get to the island. And one would say these are miracles, but what they saw is that there's no separation between a miracle like this or anything else we are doing. They would see that what we are doing in our daily lives are miracles. We just seem to miss it by looking at others and saying, wow, they can do this. They have a gift for storytelling. They have the ability to craft a post and touch thousands of lives. These are all miracles. And I just feel that when we begin to recognize that what we have within us is so phenomenal and so extraordinary, then we become wayfinders in the most conscious way. What I'm going to do is share three lessons of wayfinding that I feel may be of service to your community. The first one is how we navigate. So I told you about the latitude of the mind, where we synthesize all of this external data. What happens, and there's so much research that validates all of the incoming data into our systems actually goes through the heart first and then rapidly goes to the brain. What happens when we're navigating is that the navigator they find the intersection, the still point between the latitude of the mind and the longitude of the heart. And in that intersection, in that still point, is our inner compass. I believe that our heart really is our inner sanctum and our holy of holies. But when we come home to ourselves and cease looking outward for validation, cease looking outward for answers, because people have their own compasses, they cannot know what our journeys are. And when they start to give advice, or when we seek advice from someone who is not making the unique journey that we are, they cannot understand fully what path we are meant to travel. And it's imperative and incumbent upon us to follow our compass, and even to mute the advice we give to others unless they ask for it, because we cannot truly know what the lessons that someone is here to learn. So the navigator always comes home to this inner compass, and they say, it will never lead you astray. It will never misguide you. And the more we hone it, it's like a muscle. It will get stronger and stronger. until we know it so well that we don't have to work hard to access it. So a few years ago, some years ago, during the 2004 tsunami that struck Southeast Asia and devastated that region of the world, I heard about this tribe called Mokan, and I was so fascinated to know how this small tribe of 2,000 people didn't even sustain injury when hundreds of thousands of lives were lost in the tsunami. And so some years later, I went with a research team to the Andaman Sea because I wanted to know what these people did to survive. And I wanted to know how these lessons can apply to our lives. What I found was that the morning of the tsunami, a small group of them had gone ashore to gather food, and an elder was with them. And when they went into the forest, the elder realized that the birds were not singing. And here again, now we have a heightened state of awareness that he recognized a break in the pattern. And he didn't know what the problem was, but he knew there was a serious problem. So he called for everyone to take higher ground. Now, the people on the boats in that time of the morning in Thailand, in Southeast Asia, the dolphins are normally resting in shallow waters. The Mokan on their boats saw the dolphins racing out to deeper oceans. Again, there was a break in the pattern. And so they followed the dolphins out. And this is how this tribe survived. The lesson here for us, in whatever it is we're doing, is to pay close attention, is to practice keen observation and notice all of the cues in our environment, whether it's in business, whether it is in the office. There are cues constantly that are giving us data, and really valuable data. And then we take all of that into our inner compass and begin to navigate that way. And this was just one example of how people are paying attention to these cues. The second lesson on wayfinding that I find probably one of the most powerful lessons there is that when we are on the ocean and my mentor or other navigators are on board, they have a certain seat that's relegated just for the navigator. And he or she goes into a deep state of stillness. And while it appears to the untrained eye that we are sailing toward an island, now bear in mind, an island can be anything. It can be your dreams, it can be your goals, it can be your desires. But what it looks like when we're on the ocean, it looks to the untrained eye that we are sailing to the island. What is actually happening for the navigator, for the wayfinder, is that he or she harnesses all of their mana, their life force, and they see the destination so clearly in their mind's eye that they draw the island to them. It's completely counterintuitive in our society, but it truly, if you remember nothing else that I share with you, this is one of the most profound things you can apply. I believe, as I watch people as an anthropologist in our modern society, we're constantly pushing out. We're striving and trying, and we've got all of these hacks going on, and we're spilling our life force out into the world, and we become weaker and weaker with this dissipation. What happens is that when we start to harness and trust that everything within us, we have all of the answers that we seek, that when we start to harness that and create an unwavering vision of what it is we desire. In Polynesia, the first order of business before we go forward with a desire is to question if it will cause harm to anyone or anything. And if it does, we stop and we will not go forward with it. And if what you desire will cause no harm to another or to life itself, then what we do is harness that vision so clearly that nothing can get it in its way. And there are more parts of this process, but for now, this is an important piece of this equation. We draw it into us, and now quantum physics validates this so clearly, what these cultures have always practiced, that within us we are powerful beyond measure, that when we speak, the whole universe conspires in our favor. It's just that we don't believe it anymore because we have forgotten who we are, and we have relegated our authority and our agency to others and to the world. And the sad truth about this is that we cannot serve the world until we step back into our power. So that's the second lesson. The third lesson is this. On the canoe, we are in a finite environment, meaning that on board the canoe, we have a limited number of resources. So how one person uses those resources affects the whole. We also understand that on board the canoe, we are only as safe as the weakest link. And so it is imperative and incumbent upon all of us that we keep everyone strong, because that cultivates our protection and our safety and our survival. But more than that, before we even launch the canoe and before we get on board to set sail, we gather in a circle and we ho'oponopono, we clear everything up, because we've been working for months to prepare for this voyage. And the voyage itself is so sacred that we want to make sure that we are clear vessels getting onto a vessel. So we will sit in a circle with the agreement that we come with love. We ask for forgiveness if at any time we have injured another. We forgive anyone who has injured us. And we set ourselves and everyone free. And then we get on the vessel and we begin to share. We begin to set sail. And this is important for any team, for any organization, for any group of people that are making a voyage together. So going back to the resources, the way one of us uses the resources on the vessel affects the whole. My teacher, Ma, would always say, the planet is the canoe and the canoe is the planet. That means how one country, how one community, how one person uses the resources ultimately affects us all. And I love the idea of community building intentionally with this degree of wisdom, with this degree of commitment. And Lon, whatever you would like to ask me around this, I'm open to all of it.
First, I could listen to you all day. You are so powerful and inspiring. Some of the things that was very powerful to me. This whole notion of there's so much abundance in the world, but when you think in lack, it prevents you from being able to connect with the broader universe, whether you call it quantum physics, God, or Allah, or whatever, if you're agnostic, that we are interconnected, and there's this power in tapping into that. And the other thing you said that really got me was we cannot serve until we understand our power and our internal compass. And we all have this inner voice, but it gets drowned out by all of the noise, right? Whether that's our computers, entertainment, or whatnot. So this whole notion of wayfinding is so beautiful. And I think I don't know about the folks who are listening to this, but when I was listening to it, I saw so many commonalities between wayfinding and my personal kind of journey, trying to find me and trying to live a purposeful life. How does wayfinding help those who are on the call? Why does it matter today? And how can wayfinding help us find our voice in our story?
Wonderful, wonderful. To answer your question, why wayfinding matters more than ever is because the world is struggling and people feel lost. We see this around mental health. We see this around communities throughout the world that are struggling. Being with many of these cultures that have been homogenized and marginalized and acculturated. I'm watching in real time what's going on. And I know that The essence of wayfinding invites us all to step into our lives. James Allen, it's a favorite quote of mine by James Allen. He said, "We do not attract that which we want, we attract that which we are." And the only way we can serve the world is to truly step in, not with any false humility, and certainly not with an ego that's run amok, but true mastery and true wayfinding is walking a humble path so clearly that you don't have to scream for attention. In fact, you don't need it at all. You don't need approval of others. You don't need any external validation to do the work that you have come to do. You simply have to trust that what you have within yourself is more than enough always, and honor that path and follow it with all of your heart.
Oh gosh. I'm just taking all of this in. I'm usually not speechless, but this is such a powerful conversation for me. What are some of the most important lessons that we can learn from wayfinding, and how can we apply them to our day-to-day life?
So the lessons are what I discussed, the latitude and the longitude, in order to find and hone our inner compass. That's critical. So we take in the data that we find valuable, and we're always choosing from moment to moment because there's so much data that's coming in rapid order. Taking in only what we need and really being discerning. I think the power of our discernment is imperative, that we start to trust ourselves so much that we can start to tune out that which no longer serves us. The voices, the relationships, the circumstances, all of that. We must become our own greatest discerner, because nobody can do that for us. And that's part of taking back the ownership and our responsibility of our lives and the power of our lives. But to become so discerning that we say, no, this no longer serves me. I bless it and I release it. And the same thing goes for everything in our lives. The beautiful thing about just coming out of COVID is that it gave me deep time to reflect, to reevaluate, and to course correct, because I found that I was so busy that I was being absent to some of the things that mattered most. And so I appreciate how you opened up with your journey at the beginning. And when we start to honor that, something happens within us and we shift our own field. When my mentor Mao would go into a room, it shifted the field because he knew who he was and he knew the presence that he carried. Now, he never spoke a word, and oftentimes he was back in the back of the room, but he knew that when he entered the room, the field shifted. When we were growing up, whoever was allowed to prepare our food could not prepare our food if they were not in a state of joy or pleasantness, because my parents knew that would be infused in our food. When I create a social media post, and I'm not so active except on LinkedIn, and that's only been in this last year, I do not create a post without that state of mind, because I know that the frequency with which I'm creating is going into the post, and I feel a great responsibility to everything I create.
Wow. So I watched some of your TED Talks and interviews prior to this, and you talk about the still point and how mystics call it the inner sanctum, and how it's important for us to find our kind of personal North Stars. How do you go about, you mentioned taking away the noise, and it reminds me of one of the things that I always tell people, which is if you want to change your life, there's only really two ways to do that, and it's what you add to your life and what you take out, right? So how do you take away the noise and the judgment and what society wants, and how do you sit still and really add into your life? For me, surrounding myself with this community, surrounding myself with friendships that uplift me. For me, leaving jobs and opportunities that just don't sit well with me, or that being with people who don't value me. It's about addition, but also subtraction, right?
Yes.
how does this still point kind of work for us?
Good question. The way in is stillness. If that is meditation, if that is being in nature, whatever brings us back to ourselves, home to ourselves. And in terms of what we take away and what we add, we can only see most clearly when we are in a moment of quietude. And people will say, Elizabeth, that's hard for me because the world is so loud. I say, then do it incrementally. Go into the stillness for a moment and just give yourself the gift of that moment, but with absolute presence. And then expand it to another moment and another moment. Go and be with nature, and all you're doing is keenly observing nature. Mao would often say, when I couldn't find my way, he would often say, Elizabeth, close your eyes, because then you can see. He knew that my sight was blinded by my physical sight, but when I closed my eyes, I knew exactly where the wind was, even though I couldn't feel it on almost windless nights. I could sense it because our senses are alive and well in us. And so for people to apply this in their daily lives, it's simple, but it's not always easy. But as we begin to build that muscle, it becomes a place that we trust so completely that everything else just feels like white noise.
Yeah, and I was just feeling it right now, just listening to you and your voice. I started realizing that I wasn't breathing and to just sit and start focusing on your breath and listening to your voice, but also remembering to breathe. And I really love your advice in terms of like being out in nature, because I know when I live in Westchester and there's a lot of trees and deer, and I've made it a habit just to, when I wake up in the morning, go out, and once I drop my daughter off at the bus stop, to just continue that walk and to be in my thoughts or to be in quiet. And just there's so much that you can discover in that silence.
Yes, yes.
Right.
And also, nature is constantly speaking to us. And so in Hawaiian, the word for tree is also the word for teacher. And in other traditions, there are similar thoughts. So to be in nature and understand that we are always being taught, if we open ourselves up to the fact that we are always students. And going back to your interconnectedness, when we understand that this is a gift of reciprocity, I'm speaking to you and I'm learning from you and I'm sharing, and your community, we are all engaging on so many levels. We can only see maybe one or two, but we are engaging in such a way that when we understand that what we are bringing to the world, when we really bring our heart with this truth and this great humility and the privilege of really serving in that way, it's, for me, I cannot think of anything more important than to bring ourselves to the world in the most humble and true way.
I love that. I've posted about this before, and I talk about how I call all of us raindrops. What I always say is what we do seems small and inconsequential, but like raindrops, when we come together, we become the ocean. And it's this ocean that creates ripples, and ripples become waves. And that's how change happens. That's how revolutions happen. Um, it's when we all come together, right? And this is how we change the world. Just in case you guys are wondering why I always call you guys raindrops, I'm a raindrop as well. But we're all teachers and we're all learners, right? So I'm gonna open it up to questions in a second, but I want to ask you a question because I think I read one of your posts, or I think it might have been an article, that how you lost your husband from cancer at 50, and at 51 you led one of the most dangerous expeditions in your career. How did wayfinding help you find your way back home?
Wayfinding teaches us that we cannot fear the storms, whatever those storms are in our lives, that it's by leaning into them, having the courage to lean into them, that we are changed and we are strengthened. So wayfinding teaches me resilience on a daily basis, that anything that it feels just outside of my comfort zone, lean into it intelligently, but lean into it. So, you know, at 50, to go to an island that National Geographic has never been to reminded me how remote it was. I had to negotiate with the Micronesian government for a cargo ship to get us there, and then organize 5,000 pounds of provisions because the island had nothing. And my mentor was dying on this island. And at the time, I didn't realize there was such a thing as a National Geographic Explorer, but National Geographic started tracking my work because they've been to most places, but this island is not one of them. And so I was also the first woman ever to land on this island as an outsider, as a leader of a crew. And the chiefs there didn't know what to do with me because they were so accustomed to leaders being men. And many of today's navigators are men, and women are among the best navigators because they're the most sensitive. So it takes all of us, but it takes all of us to show up in doing our parts and to have the courage to show up in whatever way we are.
I love that. Does anyone want to ask Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay a question? If you want, you could just unmute and ask, or you can put it in the chat as well. If not, I'm going to say some comments from the chat. Tony Saunders has a question. Tony, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to ask it?
Oh, thank you. I'll ask it. Thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth. Really enjoyed your talk, and I want to look up your TED Talk. I'm glad you mentioned it. So while you're talking, again, this is the first time I've heard of it, taking it all in, but in some ways it seems that wayfinding is more individually based versus the community. And you mentioned the boat. We all are as strong as our longest seek, but I guess it's being hard for me to understand the difference between me going in versus being out with everyone else. Thank you.
Great question, Tony. Thank you for asking, because in my mind, I'm so accustomed to wayfinding that I think of, so lives, we are all wayfinders. When we're actually sailing or in an organization, there is often a structure, a hierarchy of sorts, although we don't think in terms of hierarchy, but we certainly recognize the navigator on board the canoe. It can be a team leader, it can be an executive, it doesn't really matter. But when we start to see that we come to the table as a wayfinder in our lives, when we are part of an organization or part of a crew, we recognize that we are part of a system that's making a voyage together. And we see what our role is to this group, to this community that we are serving. And our commitment is to serve in our capacity as best we can for the safety and the success of the whole. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And
It does. Thank you.
And the way I interpret this as well is that we all have our personal journeys as individuals, but there's also this broader journey that we need to go, whether it's in your business or society or in the world, right? If we really want to change the things that are happening in the world, we have to come together. So there's our individual kind of journey and destination, but there's also the broader one, whether it's your community or the broader world. We have a question from Venice. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, hi there. Hi, Lon.
Hi, great having you here.
Look, I'm in between errands, but here I am. I just am so grateful that you, Dr. Elizabeth, have joined LinkedIn and that you're there, because I love when you reply to my post. I love following you. And you are such a spirit that is so transcendent beyond what we're going through. I have chills listening to you, and I just love you so much. Just thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind words. And may I say this, that we are all waves of the same sea. So the only way you can recognize these qualities in me is because you bear them. And so I bow deeply to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I have another question that is anonymous, just because it's a little personal. So the question is, this person feels lost. They love what they're doing, but the company environment is not positive. They are worried about failing and going to another company, but they don't feel like they can stay in the current environment much longer. So goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is following your internal compass that's telling you shouldn't stay. This doesn't feel right. But then the part of you but I need to pay my mortgage, or I'm too old, or if I don't get another job, or let's say for people who are laid off and they're in fear now. Okay, there's that logical, but there's also that internal compass that's saying who believes in yourself. How do you kind of reconcile those thoughts?
Sure, very good question. Because on the one hand, we must be responsible and to our lives, to those who are counting on us, and on a very practical level, it's important that that be an essential part of the equation. I would encourage the person who asked the question to really go to inner silence, and part of this is the gift. Joseph Campbell says, where we stumble, there is our gold, there is our treasure. And I always think about this because where I am feeling lost, I know that there is a treasure that's waiting for me, a vein of gold that I haven't tapped. For me, sometimes when I'm in a situation that I feel is not serving me well, and yet I, for practical reasons, need to be there, I start to envision what it is I do want and really start to build for me a clear dream and vision, my island of what it is I do want, and take that into my quietude, into my moments of stillness, and start to see that, because like attracts like. And when we start to put more of our focus on what it is we do want, and start to reduce our focus on what it is we don't want or don't like, all of a sudden it changes us in deep ways. Even the most subtle shifts are course corrections. And the beautiful thing about course corrections is we can do them in micro ways. We can course correct 1 degree, but that 1 degree shift will change the trajectory of our destination. So when we start to know for ourselves what it is we're seeking, start to hone in and start to go into the quietude and say, what will get me there? How do I navigate from where I currently am to this island? Show me how to do that. And it's so fascinating how the universe truly does conspire. When I was preparing to go to lead that expedition, everybody told me I couldn't. It was going to take $250,000, which I didn't have at the time. And it was going to be one of the most difficult journeys I'd ever lead. And it sounds crazy. And it's so important to share this bit of a story with you because it really will, I believe, answer the question. I sat in all of my practicality, knowing that I didn't have the money to pay for the provisions to get the crew and me to this island. And I went into deep stillness and wept because the cargo ship was leaving and I had 5 days to buy the provisions and load up the container. And I wept because that window was closing. And I heard a voice say, everything you need, you already have. And I knew what my bank account looked like, and I knew I didn't have it. I will tell you, that afternoon, I got a call from someone who had retrieved my mail that I didn't realize. That day, I got a tax return for $251,000. We cannot explain these things. I can only say it's more important that you honor your dreams and love yourself so much that you are not willing to compromise this time, this beautiful finite life that we have been given. We cannot do it when we cannot play smaller than we know in our hearts we truly are.
Woo. I am like literally lost for words. That is so beautiful. Everything you need, you already have. That is. Whew.
Yeah.
We are up for time, but Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay, how can we support you? How can we find you? Let us know.
Oh my goodness, LinkedIn is really the only place that I'm active, and how you can support me is really stepping into your lives fully and bravely. This is exactly what the world needs. We were born for these times, and we must be willing to lean in. And when we do it together, at least for myself, I feel braver together. So, if I can support you, I'm on LinkedIn, but my wish and my prayer is that we all step into our destinies.
I love that. And if you can all, on the top right-hand side, put this in gallery mode so we should see everyone. Please unmute yourself. Please turn on your videos, because I think Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay deserves a big round of applause. Woohoo! Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was so powerful. That was so amazing. We will upload this to our YouTube channel, Community 7, so please join us if you can. Please follow Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay on LinkedIn. I know I do, and all of her posts are so inspirational, and you will get so much value from them. Once again, thank you, everyone. Elizabeth, you are truly immense and just a truth teller. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you. Woohoo. See ya.